Hi class, in this recording we're going to be focusing on cardiac output and how preload and other variables influence cardiac output. So let's dive into it. As we look at cardiac output, stroke volume is a key player in governing or determining cardiac output. Just to review, stroke volume is the amount of blood ejected from the left ventricle with one contraction of the left ventricle. And there are three variables that govern stroke volume. We have the preload, contractility, and afterload. And we're going to talk about these three variables in more detail in subsequent slides. But just to use this terminology, we have some example statements right here. So if I increase the preload or if I increase the contractility, I'm going to increase stroke volume. So if these first two variables are increased, stroke volume goes up. And if I increase afterload, I'm going to cause stroke volume to decrease. So as I look at afterload, afterload has an inverse effect on stroke volume, where an increase in afterload causes a decrease in stroke volume. Nope, too far there. So as we look at preload, preload is formally defined as a tension. And then I remember as a student, oh, this made my head hurt. Preload is not end diastolic volume. It is different, distinctly different, but related to end diastolic volume. Specifically, end diastolic volume is a volume of blood in the ventricle when the ventricle is done relaxing. The preload is the amount of tension in the left ventricle or within the myocardium, the muscular layer of the left ventricle, at when the ventricle is done contracting, or another way of phrasing it is immediately before it does contract. So as we have an increase in preload, we're going to have an increase in tension in the walls of the ventricles, and that's going to cause an increase in force of contraction. So if preload goes up, force of contraction, generally speaking, goes up. Now, if we have exercise or if we're moving our bodies, that's going to cause more blood to flow back to the heart with our venous return. That's going to stretch the myocardium and increase preload, because preload increases the more we stretch out the myocardium, because that stretching of the myocardium increases the tension of the myocardium. Those cardiomyocytes, while they're stretched out, are going to generate more tension, and that increase in tension is going to cause an increase in cardiac output, which corresponds to the increase in the venous return. Another way of thinking of preload is this is the way that our heart maintains balance. If we send more blood to the heart needs to compensate by sending more blood away from the heart. Otherwise, blood will pool within the chambers of the heart, and that ain't good for nobody. So as we're looking at this preload and how we can quantify it, or just come up with some relationships, it's been defined or described by the Frank-Starling law of the heart. And I love this little squiggly variable. To me, it looks like a beetle. That little squiggly variable is a math term for proportional to. And I used a lot of those when I was taking physical chemistry. So as we look at stroke volume, it's proportional to end diastolic volume. And so if end diastolic volume goes up, stroke volume goes up. Another way of saying this is describing this is the more blood that's in the left ventricle, the more the tension is on the walls of the left ventricle. And the ventricles need to eject nearly as much blood as they receive. As we look at the Frank-Starling law mathematically, I included this figure to give you the relationships, the correlations. So if left ventricular end diastolic volume, EDV, is going up, and that is a bad unit right there, shame on them. That's a unit of pressure, not a unit of volume. So as we're looking at an increase in left ventricular end diastolic volume, we have an increase in stroke volume because of that increase in the preload. So as we look at the shifts in contractility with our curve, we find that more blood equals more tension equals larger stroke volumes. Now, this tension-length relationship also corresponds to skeletal muscle tissue, but not quite as strongly just because of some structural differences between the sarcomeres of a cardiomyocyte compared to the sarcomeres of a skeletal muscle fiber. As we look at contractility, the technical term for contractility of the heart is inotropy, or an inotropic agent. We've already talked about chronotropic agents, which influence the speed of the heart rate, or the frequency of the heart contractions. So a positive chronotropic agent increases heart rate, a negative chronotropic agent decreases heart rate. We can say the same thing of inotropic agents, but with reference to contractility. Positive inotropic agents make the heart contract with more force. Negative inotropic agents make the heart contract with less force. As we're looking at these inotropic agents, there are some things that can influence the rate of the force of contraction. One is hypercalcemia. So when we think of calcium, calcium is used to initiate the cross-bridge cycle within the sarcomeres of the cardiomyocyte. Calcium, also with cardiomyocytes in particular, is used to influence the length, the time length, the duration, I should say, of contraction, and also used to influence membrane voltages. So as we're looking at calcium, we'll come back to calcium in just a little bit when we get to digitalis. We also have the catecholamines. These catecholamines are the androgenic hormones, the hormones of the sympathetic nervous system. So if we think of the sympathetic nervous system, that's the fight or flight branch of the autonomic nervous system. So if you're stressed out or scared, your heart rate goes up because you're getting ready for some physical activity. If we have more glucagon present in the cardiomyocytes, glucagon is going to cause there to be more cyclic AMP. Cyclic AMP, or cyclic adenosine monophosphate, or CAMP as most people like to call it, is a secondary messaging molecule within the cardiomyocytes that increases strength of contraction. And then also digitalis. If people are taking digitalis, that's going to raise the intracellular calcium level and cause there to be more contraction strength. Digitalis was initially isolated from the genus digitalis, the foxglove flower, which is beautiful. You can see there's a nice little pretty bumblebee on these purple foxgloves. I love foxglove. And it was found, and this is an example of traditional medicine having a very legitimate, very real scientific basis, and how it's been mimicked in Western medicine. So now, instead of drinking digitalis tea to help with your low blood pressure, people can now take purified digitalis, and that purified digitalis will travel to a cardiomyocyte. So here at the bottom of the lower right-hand corner is just a beautiful figure of a cardiomyocyte. As we're looking at this cardiomyocyte, digitalis is going to neutralize the sodium-potassium pump, and that, is going to upregulate that sodium-potassium pump. And as we upregulate that sodium-potassium pump, ultimately, we're going to cause there to be more calcium ions in the cell. And as we have more calcium ions in the cell, we're going to have an increase in inotropy. So as we look at these inotropic agents that can reduce contractility, so these negative inotropic agents, we have hypocalcemia, which is the opposite of hypercalcemia. So instead of having too much calcium, we have low blood calcium levels, and that's going to reduce the strength of contraction and give us a weak, irregular heartbeat because it's very difficult for us to initiate the cross-bridge cycle. A lot of times the heart will just arrest or stop its contraction relaxation cycle in distally when somebody's suffering from hypocalcemia. We can also have hyperkalemia. Hyperkalemia is excessive amounts of potassium. If we have excessive potassium levels, we are going to reduce the strength of myocardial contraction because we are going to have weaker action potentials on those cardiomyocytes. And we're going to have an excessive amount of calcium released into the sarcoplasm. If you don't remember that term, the sarcoplasm is the cytoplasm of a muscle cell, in this case of a cardiomyocyte. Hyperkalemia is rather difficult to detect because potassium ions can diffuse so rapidly throughout a patient. And there's so many potassium leak channels. And I know a couple recordings ago I had that Hercule Poirot murder mystery reference. The idea behind this is that if you give a patient potassium, or a high dose of potassium, usually something innocuous like potassium carbonate or some potassium bound with an innocuous anion. That potassium will cause hyperkalemia, that inducing the heart attack. The patient's heart will stop pumping. They'll have a lot of negative inotropic agent effects. And then after the patient is deceased, the potassium will diffuse rapidly throughout the patient, making it very difficult to detect those areas of high concentrations. Another inotropic effect is the vagus nerve. And when we think of the vagus nerve, that is the nerve of the parasympathetic nervous system, cranial nerve 10, that travels to the heart and down regulates the contractile strength on the atria. There are very few nerves to the ventricles, or nerve branches to the ventricles, for the ventricle to have a significant effect. But if we down regulate the contractile strength of the atria aren't going to contract with as much force. That means the atria send less blood to the ventricles, and that's going to reduce preload contractility. So by downregulating the atria, the vagus nerve can indirectly downregulate the ventricles by reducing preload. And then we have afterload. As we look at afterload, afterload is formally defined as the sum of all forces opposing the ejection of blood from the left ventricle, singular. So when we think of afterload, really it's just the force that pushes blood back into the heart. The single biggest component of afterload is blood pressure. And when we get to the chapter on blood vessels, we'll spend a lot of time talking about blood pressure and how to calculate it and things that influence it. But let's just say if you have hypertension, high blood pressure, you're going to have high afterload. And that high blood pressure is going to oppose blood leaving your heart. And it's going to mean that your heart has to work even harder to get enough blood out. If we have high blood pressure, that high blood pressure means the semilunar valves, the aortic valve, the pulmonary valve, have a hard time opening. And that high blood pressure is going to ultimately downregulate the amount of stroke volume that you have. So if somebody has high blood pressure, they're going to have a hard time doing exercise because their heart has a harder time pumping blood to the rest of the body. Hypertension is the single biggest factor that increases afterload. And if somebody has hypertension, it's typically considered a contraindication for a lot of rigorous exercise. When I say contraindication, I mean that it's a medical condition that prevents them from doing some kind of an activity or receiving some kind of a treatment. So as we look at afterload, it's stuff that it pushes blood back into the heart, or impedes arterial circulation. So as we're looking at lung disease, the lungs, if we have some kind of a disease in the lungs that makes it harder for blood to circulate through the lungs, that's going to increase afterload, especially on the right ventricle. So if somebody has some kind of pulmonary restriction or pulmonary disease that's restricting circulation, that left ventricle is going to have to work really, really hard to overcome afterload, the excessive amount of afterload that's being placed on just the left ventricle. And what we find is that we'll have hypertrophy of the wall of the left ventricle. If you see a heart that looks like this, where the wall of the right ventricle, I need to put an R over here for right so I can get my left and right straight. So we have hypertrophy of the wall of the right ventricle. So if you see a heart that looks like this, where the wall of the left ventricle, come on, there we go. Wall of the left ventricle is thinner than the wall of the right ventricle. That's a giant red flag that individual is at risk of cor pulmonale. And if we look at cor pulmonale, this is a condition where we have the right ventricle fail because of that obstructed pulmonary circulation. What are examples of diseases that can obstruct pulmonary circulation? We have emphysema, chronic bronchitis, or black lung disease. And almost nobody gets black lung disease anymore. And in case it's more of a historical disease at this point. And in case you haven't heard of it, black lung disease was a disease that used to affect coal miners who didn't wear respirators and spent years and years breathing in this fine black particulate of ground up coal dust. So if you were to take a bunch of charcoal, pulverize it, and then breathe it in deeply and spend a couple years huffing charcoal, you would develop black lung disease. But nobody does that anymore, and OSHA thankfully requires people to wear respirators and breathing masks when they go into a coal mine now. Emphysema and bronchitis, though, are still, unfortunately, very common. So as we look at exercise and cardiac output and how exercise influences cardiac output, ultimately, and this is no surprise here, when you exercise, your metabolic needs go up for your muscles, and in response to that, your heart works harder to increase cardiac output. So the more you exercise, the more blood you're going to pump. Now we have proprioceptors, and just to review again, a proprioceptor is a special sensory structure that senses your position in time and space. And this is how you can know how your body is oriented, even though you're upside down in the deep end of a swimming pool with your eyes closed. You still have an intuitive sense of what up is and what down is, and how your arms and legs are oriented relative to each other. So when we just start exercising, even before we have the dramatic increase in metabolic needs, the proprioceptors say, hey, I'm moving around a lot. I should probably start pumping blood more in anticipation of the increase in metabolic needs. We also find that sympathetic output from the cardiac center of the brain, so in other words, when we activate our fight or flight response, that's also going to increase cardiac output. And then as we look at the veins, if we have increased muscular activity, so let's think of the skeletal muscles, and we haven't gotten to blood vessels yet, but your veins depend on contractions of skeletal muscles to get the blood back to the heart. So the more we're contracting our skeletal muscles, the more blood we're going to send back to the heart through the veins, and that's going to increase the preload and ultimately the cardiac output. So as we look at exercise and cardiac output, as heart rate goes up, so the frequency of contractions goes up, and stroke volume goes up, the amount of blood ejected per contraction, we're going to have an increase in cardiac output. I mean, this is a wonderful equation. I mean, it's super simple and straightforward. Cardiac output equals heart rate multiplied by stroke volume. Boom, bada bing, bada boom, memorize that equation. I circled it and started on a previous recording. So as we look at exercise, if we have lots of exercise, we can have ventricular hypertrophy. And ventricular hypertrophy isn't necessarily a bad thing. It can or cannot be. It depends on the situation. If you have ventricular hypertrophy from exercise, that's a good thing. If you have ventricular hypertrophy because you have lots of afterload or resistance to blood flowing out of your heart, that's a bad thing. So if we have exercise-induced ventricular hypertrophy, that's going to increase stroke volume, allowing the heart to beat slower at rest, so the heart can relax more when you're not exercising. So athletes typically are going to have a very high cardiac reserve, and they can tolerate a lot more exertion because they are able to upregulate cardiac output more than a sedentary person who doesn't have that same cardiac reserve. And if you can't remember this, what cardiac reserve is the difference in cardiac output when you're at rest compared to the maximum possible cardiac output you can achieve. So athletes have a very high maximum output of cardiac output compared to the couch potato who doesn't. That's all we have for this recording. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to post them in the class discussion board or shoot me an email. And as always, happy studies.